Tommy Tibahia, aka UMMAGAWD on the whole interwebs and things like that. I've been flying and building, I should say, multi-rotors FPV drones since like I want to say early 2012, and have been flying commercially, in other words, being paid to do FPV gigs probably since 2015, but really jumping into the more professional cinema commercial high production world since 2018. So probably the biggest job that I've worked on would be Black Panther 2, and I did basically all of the what you would call VFX plate shots for that, which just simply means it's giving the VFX artist the canvas to sort of paint the action sequence for the final movie.
That's really cool. I'm surprised to hear that they used a. When I think of drone shots, I think of sort of flying camera action shots, right? I'm surprised they were using drone shots for FX plates. How come? Tell me more about the decision to do that.
I mean, like I obviously I can't tell you the exact reason because the higher ups are making the decisions on about how these make. But if you think about when you're making a movie, especially something like Black Panther or really any of those Marvel superheroes where they're flying and they've got these very intricate flying suits or costumes, if you will, it's they have to have a way to fine tune all of that into a realistic background so that you've got this feeling that it's as real as it can be without it actually being real, if that makes sense.
I see. So they're plate shots for flying scenes. They don't have you just like hovering, getting like a background plate.
No,
It's
because sometimes it could be me following the talent or the actor or whatever was eventually going to be VFXed in. And so they want that feeling like, oh, this is somebody that's flying with them. And so the only way to really get that, especially when it comes to like flying things that are also flying, is through an FPV shot. There's also the normal gimbal style stuff, but that's more of like a camera tripod in the sky, watching them go from here to there. But when you want to feel like you're in, the actual
yeah.
sequence, that's where FPV comes into play. And it is a very new thing. I gotta say that, right? So it's a new thing that they're using FPV style shots to do plates with.
Let's talk about when the first job where you made a transition from, like, you've been a professional FPV pilot, you with Rotor Riot, UMMAGAWD brand, you've been doing that for years. But let's talk about the first job where you made a transition into sort of mainstream commercials, movies, etc. So start with, my first sort of pro job was.
I think my first pro job, and I'm going to just caveat this by saying pro as in like a recognizable brand name, right? Because I feel like I've been doing like one-offs for smaller mom and pop style brands for a while, but I think the moment when I got that call and I heard it was for Honda, specifically for like their bikes, I would say that's probably the first time where I was like, okay, this is a pretty big name, and I'm flying. In my head, I'm flying these toys, so I'm like, this is crazy. And that was back in January 2018 is I'd say when that happened, and I was like, okay, I think I've just walked through this door of a new level of professionalism working with the bigger brands. And I think, hey, I think FPV in terms of cinema is starting to take off.
A lot of people are like, okay, how do I make that transition? How do I make those connections? So tell us how you made that connection, right? And speaks, if you can, speak specifically about that, but also then sort of more generally, how were you putting yourself out there? How are you networking? How are you sort of lining up gigs?
Okay, in terms of getting into this, that Honda job specifically, and really all of the jobs up before that has strictly just been posting on social media platforms, just like how you and I would post like, hey, check out this crazy flight. The difference, however, I think is that like I've always had a special section in my heart, at least when I went to go fly, where I was like, I want it to look good. It wasn't necessarily because I did a crazy trick or a crazy flip or a crazy stunt, but more because like sometimes like, and I'm sure you can attest to this, sometimes we go out to fly somewhere, it's not the most exciting place in the world. And so then you're left with the idea of, as a content creator, how can I show this in the most interesting or entertaining kind of way. And so I think because I had a little bit of a focus on that, other people who were cinematographers, not necessarily higher up in the upper echelon side of things like movies or commercials, were looking at that and were like, hey, that's a new way of capturing content and showing a subject or an environment in a very new and refreshing kind of way. And I think that, spoke to certain people, and then they would just contact me, via the DMs and say, hey, how'd you like to try XYZ? And then it kind of just snowballed from there.
Basically, what you're saying is you were posting to social media and people found you.
Yeah. Now here's my caveat. I'll say that to get into the world of this, that is absolutely the start, right? Because your social media presence is your portfolio, right? But to get to what I've learned, at least, to get to the point of like high production, commercial, big, well-known brands, at that point, it's who you know and can you prove yourself? It was a vast difference, Josh, when I went from doing these one-offs, to all of a sudden I'm doing something with like Ford or Toyota. And instead of showing up to set and it was like, hey, here's like 4 or 5 people that you're going to be working with. Holy crap, there's like 300 people here with like 20 semi trucks and like there's so many different departments. And I'm like, oh my God, like where am I at? When you get to that level, it's going to be who you know and whether or not they decide like you're cut out to live in that world.
So people probably aren't going to just go straight from, they're going to be on social media, someone's going to notice them and they're going to hire them for the next Black Panther. Do you think that people are going to work their way up through kind of like if somebody's a freestyle pilot right now, or maybe they fly Cinewhoops and they want to start getting their name out there, should they start with how should they start?
If you got into FPV and you figured out like, hey, this is something that I really like to do, and you feel like you've got a good talent for it, and your end state goal is to get into the highest upper echelon of like clients in production world, in my opinion, I think what needs to happen is, first of all, you really have to have an eye for cinematography. So it's not, can you fly? It's not just a matter of like, can you fly? Right? That is just half of the equation. And in fact, I'd say that's like a third of the equation, because in that regard, to make the long story short, you have to have such good control of your drone that you need to be able to do exactly what you want from A to B at the timing that you want under pressure, right? Because you go onto set, there is no warm-up pack, right? I'm sure you remember when we go out to fly, it's like, let me just take a warm-up pack. Let me just kind of get used to things and kind of get into it. There's, you'd be lucky if you get that on set. So you have to be able to just plug in super cold and just do exactly what is being asked of you to do. Then the second part of it is you have to have the eye for it, because more often than not, depending on the production gig, the director, the DP, they'll have an idea of what they want. So you need to be able to execute on that. But in the event that they don't, then they turn to you and you become more of a DP role, a director of photography role. And they ask you, what, this is what's going to happen. What do you think looks good? So you have to have those two things. And then the third thing is you got to be able to do it under stress, because could be hundreds of people that are looking at you, making sure that you can get this done on time in the 1 or 2 takes. Otherwise, people aren't going to lunch on time. You know what I mean? And then it's kind of stressful, or you don't get the shot, and or whatever. Just anything. There's so many things that could happen when you're on set. But the idea is that you got to be able to handle these things under stress, under pressure, and be able to perform. So all of that said, you should be posting to social media and coming up with these ideas, of how to stick out, but from that point on is like, you just got to get people to notice you. And once people start noticing you, then they start vetting you out. Like, okay, well, we know that you maybe have the look. We know that you can control your quad at a moment's notice with under pressure, and that's the next part is like, okay, now can you perform with a gun held to your head? Because when you're on set and on production, time is money. Like you can't be taking 3, 4, 5 times to to get the shot. You got to nail it. If you can get it in one take, you start to kind of make a name for yourself and people notice.
Let's go back to the question of somebody who wants to start building their portfolio as a professional. And obviously, one thing you can do is you can just go to the park and fly around. You can go and you can try and get those epic sort of shots. But as you're pointing out, there's also the sort of professional side where you're networking, you're working with customers, you're gaining those skills that aren't just the stick skills. And you did talk about those small jobs you did, the little mom and pop jobs. Can you talk about how you started approaching those? Like when you decided you wanted to start doing more of those?
I don't know if this is going to apply in today's world, but I was fortunate enough where I got into this where make a name for yourself and to kind of just help promote the hobby. It was all about creating content, right? And for some folks, that is tricks, acrobatics, Rubik's Cube, doing crazy stunts, basically, which shows off your skill. And then there's another aspect of this that I think is more prevalent now than before, where it's like, here's just a cool environment where I'm showing you in what my opinion is the most interesting way to show you my surroundings and where I'm flying at. And I believe that that second half is what's more important if you want to get into this world, because production people, directors, they don't care if you could do a Rubik's Cube through a hole like this big. they don't care about that. What they care about is like, oh my gosh, is what I'm seeing captivating? Is it entertaining? Is it something that I want to hit replay? And so if you can focus on that, I think that's what will get you somewhere. But for me specifically, I think I was just fortunate that because that's in the back of my head when I fly. Like if you notice my freestyle videos from back in the days, it was part of it was a couple of tricks and doing something crazy, but half of it also was just these nice long lines because I wanted, the viewer to like what they're seeing and to kind of feel it. And so for me personally, it was absolutely just, I'm putting my content out there and people reached out to me. I don't know if that's going to apply today because I understand that part of that is sticking out somehow from the masses. But, I was fortunate enough where I came from a world where I was naturally sticking out because of what I was doing. And therefore, it kind of put me in front of people who were hip to the idea that this is a new way of filming things.
And it sounds like one of the things you're saying is that a person who is deciding that they want to go pro needs to be making content with a different eye than a person who's trying to be the next YouTube freestyle Mr. Steele superstar. That 100%. Directors of photography or people who are doing hiring, they don't want to see crazy freestyle tricks. I mean, maybe they do if they're fans of FPV, but that's not what they're going to hire based off of because that's not what you're doing.
Correct.
With these cinema cameras.
Correct. That is exactly it. It's the type of flying and content that you put out has to be towards the cinematography style. And it is not about the tricks that you could do. It's not about the longest building dive that you can do. I mean, granted, there's a couple of freestyle things that where it lends itself towards the cinematography, but it's more because it's a crazy perspective. It's not the fact that you can do this highly intense, complicated move, that shows off your skill, because that's just like a fraction of what it takes to, really be brought on to the job and continue to get calls.
Let's talk about other skills that people need to have in order to do this kind of work. I mean, I think most people would expect that you need to be a great pilot, but you're talking about other skills, including, people skills, professionalism, performance under pressure, even cinema skills, camera skills. Can you start with something like, what other skills do you need in order to do this other than being a pilot?
So other skills besides being a great pilot, and let's not discount that. You absolutely have to be a fantastic pilot. And just to summarize that in a nutshell, you have to be 110% confident that you can manipulate your drone to do whatever it takes to get from point A to point B while framing the shot, okay? And oftentimes in a specific timing. And not to go off on a tangent, but I think this is important. Like oftentimes what you're filming is there's some type of action happening. And so there's timing involved and there's things moving, and you have to be able to get the timing right, and with a reasonable amount of attempts to be, considered good and to be able to get the shot, to be able to get called back again. But so the piloting aside, the two things that are, I would say, just are right up there in terms of absolute critical skills is have the cinematography eye, because oftentimes, especially with FPV, you are the DP, you are the director of photography. You're ultimately deciding how this shot looks, right? And just to differentiate on that and to expand on that a little bit, the difference between your standard gimbal camera, which is normally a 3-man operation, right? You have your pilot, which is controlling where the camera is in 3-dimensional space. You have the camera operator, who is then also determining how the framing is and where things are pointed. And then you've got the guy controlling fizz, which is focus, iris, and zoom. So they're all making sure that things are focused, zoomed, etc. The difference between there is the cam op is really kind of deciding how things look. And he's kind of really telling the pilot where to go and things like that. So the difference between that and, say, an FPV guy that's doing the same thing is you're all of that. You're deciding, obviously, right? Because the camera's fixed. So you're deciding where all of that is. So you have to have the eye of understanding what makes a good looking shot based off of what the action is, or where the lighting is, or what is happening in terms of the environment. The second big critical thing that I would say is a huge skill that you have to have is just simply the ability to operate under pressure, because there's hundreds of people that are counting on you to get your shot, in the time allotted. I'll give you an example. Like, especially when it comes to like car commercials, obviously that's happening on the road. Anybody who's into FAA rules that knows that we're not allowed to fly over traffic unless there is proper what's called ITC, which is basically, stopping traffic and making sure the traffic is clear. When that happens, you only have usually 1 to 2 minutes to get your shot before they have to release traffic again. And they can only do that so many times. And so, like, you have to be ready with your gear up and ready to go literally within 30 seconds to a minute's notice. And then from that point on, you've got your 1 to 2 minutes to get your shot. And so if things aren't going right, or if you forgot something, or, again, people are looking at you, maybe you have talent that are waiting to do some type of action sequence. In the case of like big movie films where you got stunts, they might have pyrotechnics rigged with cars that are scheduled to crash into things where you only got one shot. So these are all things that are high pressure, high stress. You have to be able to think clearly and be able to execute exactly how things are planned, without fail. Otherwise, if you miss a shot, you're the guy that, you're the guy that missed a shot.
Yeah.
Or worse, maybe something doesn't go right and you crash or something like that. You need to be able to brush that off, pull out the backup drone, or repair it quickly and go up for another shot without it affecting you. And this is where I'll even just extend out where I would say that race pilots, I'm finding that a lot of race pilots are kind of finding their way into this. They're primed for this because they're used to the whole high stress environment, right? And I would say that if you're coming from the freestyle world, your leg up is that you're probably a little bit more on the creative side. So you probably have a little bit more of an idea of how to creatively come up with a way to show the environment in a way that speaks towards cinematographers. So, if I were to button those last two statements up, if you have freestyle experience and you also come from a racing background, you'll have the best, you'll have the best advantage coming into this, because you kind of have some of these natural skill sets kind of built into you that you might not have already thought about.
Could you tell a story of like a time when you screwed up or something went wrong? Like, what happened, what you learned from it? I mean, I'm not asking you to like embarrass yourself too much, but obviously I know you have a story like that.
No, we do. Absolutely. The one that I will never forget is it was for a car commercial. I'm being asked to do something pretty sketched. So you're above tree lines, and what they wanted me to do is kind of find a hole in this tree line to then dive through, which then reveals the car on this back road, like forest area. and it was a brand new drone that I haven't properly put enough time into to really understand how it flies and things like that. So I had that in the back of my head. I'm like, oh my gosh, like it was absolutely one of those things where it was a last minute gig. They wanted XYZ. We didn't want to say no. So we just did our best to make it happen, and literally like flying the rig for the first time on set, which is the worst thing you guys can do. So don't do that. Okay. However, the fault wasn't actually in that the gear was faulty. It was actually we were just such in a rush to get things going because again, lots of people are looking at you. Time is money. They're like, hey, what's taking so long? That a used battery made its way onto the drone. I didn't catch it because we're all just trying to hurry up. Sun's going down. We're losing our golden hour, all of that stuff. And I flew and not realizing there was a dead battery. And it wasn't until I'm like, oh my gosh, where's this power at that I realized what had happened. And of course, down goes the drone. And mind you, this is back when the red Komodo just came out. That was the payload that was on there. So it was like extra ouch when that went down because it was like, oh my gosh, just the stupidest mistake. And there goes like 15 grand worth of stuff. And
So what did you do? How did you first of all, how did you play that off, or did you play it off? And then what did you do? Because I mean, everybody still wants the shot, right?
oh yeah, 100%. There is no playing it off. You crash your drone on set, you crash your drone on set, everybody knows it. What matters most is how quickly can you get back up and can you get the shot before it's too late. And that's what we did. If you're a professional, you show up to these things and you have backups on backups on backups, especially when it comes to FPV, which I will say is that like, especially now more than ever, like there's just this acceptance or understanding that when it comes to FPV drones specifically, they are considered more in the stunt category, which means there's a higher risk involved, which means maybe you crash because the things that are being asked of you are difficult. So we just quickly went over to the backup and nailed the shot before the time ran out and kind of saved the day.
So let's talk about gear. Can you talk about like your sort of main quads that you use to get your shots, your camera that you use, like what kind of stuff do you bring to set? And yeah, so let's just talk about, just sort of run down your sort of main gear, your quads, your camera, your controller, goggles, etc.
The gear is actually very much what you would find in like the hobby world. And I think most people, for the most part, if you like to build stuff yourself, you'll do that, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a quadcopter or an X8, depending on what you're flying. And I think the couple of differentiators is like analog versus digital, which I'll tell you right now, in my opinion, digital by far, just hands down, is the way to go. And it's for a couple of reasons. A, the performance is there. B, there's certain situations. For instance, most recently, I just did a car commercial where it was at a container shipyard. So that's lots of metal, lots of multi-pathing, and digital just hands down wins in that department. And then the second aspect is camera, right? So what are you shooting with? And I think this is, at least in my opinion, the easiest way to figure out like what level of production. And it's not to go poo-poo on GoPro. I'm not going to say that because I think there's plenty of applications where GoPro is the most appropriate. But to be very honest, when you're at the upper end of production and you're working with high-level directors and DPs, they don't even recognize the GoPro. In fact, the red Komodo is almost even at the bottom of what's recognized in terms of cinema cameras. So obviously, when we're talking about GoPro, which I mainly use for instances where it's just such a tight spot, or I'm just working so close directly with talent where it's not safe to fly the bigger stuff. Then I'll fly like your typical run-of-the-mill Cinewhoop or even a 5-inch. On the flip side, if which is like 99% of the case for my job these days, it is the red Komodo. In which case, then at the very least, I'm running an X8 with 8-inch propellers on it. with a big like 5100 milliamp 6S pack. Most drones where you're carrying like a red Komodo or one of those cine cameras, usually it's an X8 configuration, 7-inch props at the minimum.
What is something that is different about working on set than people would expect? Something unexpected about working on set?
Probably the one of the biggest things as I started getting into this that I thought would go one way, but it's actually quite the opposite, is perfection. And when I say perfection, as a freestyle pilot, or at least that was like the prominent thing when I was into FPV, we were so obsessed about how dead smooth our tune was and how smooth our flying was and how flawless the tricks were, how well we connected things. And, so we were after this, what I'm realizing, at least in the cinematography world, this superficial high just level of perfection. Like every frame needed to be perfect in my head. But what I started finding as I'm doing this is that it doesn't actually need to be that. It just needs to be, it just needs to look great. It needs to look good. But it never needed to be 100% perfect, because the other aspect of this that most people are forgetting is, especially if you're coming from the freestyle world, is you're thinking, from the moment I take off to the moment I land, this needs to be the most epic flight ever so that it could get 1 million views. But in reality, at least when it comes to production and when you're doing these commercials and stuff, they're looking for bits and pieces. So you don't have to worry about connecting this to that and making sure that looks good. You just got to make sure that you've got your bits and pieces that look epic. And that's probably like the biggest mindset change for me, because what would happen is I'd go out and I would fly. And mind you, we're all on comms. So the DP hears what's going on because they want to be able to give feedback. And what I've learned is I need to give them the chance to hate it, because I'll hate it before any of them do. And oftentimes, if you say something, before they do, that's negative, they'll be like, oh yeah, do it again then. But what I found is if you just keep quiet, or even if you say like, this is great, they'll be like, oh, this is great. Let's go ahead. Let's move on. And that was probably like the biggest change for me, aside from the whole having to warm up thing, but I think I got used to that early on, because I've just been used to, throwing on the pack cold and just going balls to the wall. But I know a lot of people have asked me, oftentimes, like, especially, people who understand FPV and have worked with me in the past, and they hear what's being asked of me. And the first thing that goes like, oh, damn, you're just going to go for it. You're not going to warm up. And I'm like, there is no warm up, man. You just gotta go and get it. So I'd say those are the two things for me, at least.
Yeah. I guess you really, really got to know your gear to be able to
Yeah.
you're going to just put a $10,000 camera on a $8,000 quadcopter, just take it off and just go slash send it, right?
That's a good point that you bring up too. Maybe I should also mention that, like, one thing that you absolutely have to be good at too is being able to fly different rigs and just jump into it immediately. Just because from the freestyle world, I remember there was a point in time where all I did was fly my remix 5S, this payload, this exact weight, this exact prop. And if it deviated from that, it bothered me. You absolutely can't do that, because the payload will change from shot to shot. The Komodo might stay the same, but the lens that goes on there might be different. Or maybe on this specific shot, they want to see that HD downfeed over to Video Village, which means now you have to carry another 400 grams in a video transmitter that wasn't on there before. Or now we're taking this Komodo and we're throwing it onto a small Insider, which has like a 2-to-1 power weight ratio. You have to be able to jump into each of these without any kind of warm up and perform 100%. Like, that's the other like big change that I'd say that I'm a little bit more fortunate enough in being able to handle, just because I've liked flying different types of things. So I'm used to just, oh, this is different. This is 4S versus 6S, or this weighs half, or this is a 2-inch versus a 5-inch. So I'd say that's also probably another thing that you should be good at, because it will absolutely come up.
Can you tell me about like it's the first day on set. Okay. Let's say it's a motion picture, or maybe it's a commercial. I don't know if it makes a difference. You know, give us a picture of what that day is going to go like for you. You wake up at whatever time, and what's that day like? Because I think a lot of people don't know. Like they know at some point you're going to get a shot, but what's the whole rest of the day like? So take us through the day.
Once we get to a certain level of production, there's a couple of things that happens, and it actually starts before the day of the shoot. Because what happens is there's something called a tech scout. Okay. And a tech scout is all of the heads of certain departments, whether it's grip, lighting, set decoration, drone. We go out to the locations where we plan to shoot, and we have to plan accordingly. Uh, for me, as the drone pilot, there's a couple of things that happens during the scout. First of all, the director DP will have their vision of what they want to happen here. And so then they naturally ask you, can we do XYZ? Right. So there's two things that you're looking for there. The first thing is can you do what they're being asked for? Because sometimes the thing that they ask for is just absolutely crazy. But then the second thing is legally, can you fly there? So this is where your FAA Part 107 comes in, because if you're within 5 miles of an airport, there's that to deal with. If there's floor ceilings that you have to be mindful of, these are all the administrative things that you have to file permitting for, et cetera, that has to happen before even any of the shooting can really take place. So you're sitting there with the director DP, you're discussing all of these things. Assuming this all goes well, great. You get scheduled for the actual shoot day. And then the day before that, you get a call sheet, which simply tells you where you got to be at what time. Normally, it's just at the crack of dawn before light is even come out. Plenty of times where I've woken up at 3:30, 4 a.m. And mostly just because of where I live, where you got to drive out. And you get there, and normally the first thing that I do is I go get breakfast and have some coffee. And that's the cool thing that I learned once I got onto these bigger productions, is that they really do take good care of you. The idea is for you obviously not to leave set, because if you leave set, then, it's just not a good, efficient way of managing people. However, you got everything that you need there. You got food, you've got water, you've got a medic in case anything happens, because sometimes you're in different elements. I recall being in the desert, 120-degree weather, and you had a medic that was just every 30 minutes walking around, making sure everybody's drinking water, taking electrolytes, and things like that. So once the whole morning thing has been taken care of and you're feeling good and you're getting ready, that's the next thing. So you want to talk to the first AD, which is the guy who's kind of running the show and kind of orchestrating everything. And you just want to get an idea of where your shot's going to be, what time you're expected, and whether or not anything has changed in the shooting schedule. Because you normally get a storyboard of everything that's going to happen at the time it's supposed to happen, but that doesn't always pan out that way. Mostly of the time it does, but that's why you want to talk to the first AD first and make sure nothing has changed. And the second thing you want to do after that is then you got to get set up, and especially when you're doing something with like a red Komodo, it's not just making sure your batteries are plugged in and you're good to go. You got to get with your first AC, who's really in charge of the camera. And his whole role is just to make sure that the camera has the exact lens, the exact settings, the card is formatted, all of the configuration that happens in a cinema camera, which if you don't know, there's a lot. It's more than just exposure and your ISO. There's a whole lot more that goes behind that your first AC is supposed to take care of. So they got to take care of that. And then based off of that lens, then it's on me to, as it goes on there, to just make sure that, all right, this is the payload. Here's the flight time that's expected. And then you set these expectations up with the first AD, because again, time is money. So they need to know how long you could fly for. And then once you come down, how long does it take to do a battery swap? There's also the matter of getting a live feed out to what's called Video Village, which is essentially you take whatever live feed that you've got, which everybody needs to be able to see this, right? So this is what clients look at. This is what the director and DP looks at. basically all to determine whether or not you got the shot. Right. At the end of the day, if you got the shot, you get to move on. If you didn't, you keep going until you get it. So this is all the things that has to happen beforehand, and you gotta test to make sure that that live feed is going out. And the live feed could be, and this is a big reason why I had DJI for the longest time. Is DJI has at least a 720 signal that goes out, right? Because it was for the longest time it was a pain in the ass to have to explain why when it used to be analog, why analog looked a certain kind of way and things like that. And once all that's ready, which could be 30 minutes to an hour of setup, making sure everything's good. After that, you're just on standby. You're just sitting there, you're waiting for basically when it is that you're ready to go up, and if you're smart, much like in racing, if it's not your time to go up, you're probably in the goggles and you're just watching, you're trying to get information. It's a very similar thing. I'm actually by the director's, video village, watching the screen, watching what the action is so that I could preemptively figure out, okay, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do XYZ, or here's the adjustments that we need to make that we got to go talk to the first AD about, just to make sure that the shot happens correctly. And then all up until the 2-minute warning, if you have a good AD, they'll be on top of letting you know when to, hey, just heads up, you're going to be up very soon. And that's when you're plugging in, you're making sure everything's going, the cards formatted, you got good live video so that everybody can see what's happening, all the way up until it's, time for action. After that, if you got it, people will know right away, right? Because you're again, director, DP, often they're on comms with me so that I'm hearing what's going on. They'll give me feedback. We either go for the reshoot again, or we go for something completely new. And then we come back, we land, we change batteries. Somebody else handles that while I'm talking to the director, to DP. They're reviewing the footage, and if they're happy, then we move on. And then it's waiting again until that happens. And while that's happening, you're sitting there, you're charging batteries, making sure that you're just ready to go continuously all the time, all the way up until you've got all of your shots or you get repped. And, there's plenty of times where, I show up at 6 a.m. ready to shoot. I fly one battery at like 3:45. We stay there until 6, and then it's like, okay, cool, you're ready to go home. And that's often. And there's other times where if drone is, the primary camera, or what we call a cam, then you're just on all the time. Then it's just back to back, constantly charging, constantly flying, constantly getting feedback through the rest of the day. And that's also a common thing. It really just depends on what the content or the commercial or movie is happening. That determines that.
Anything else that you think the person watching this video is maybe a hobbyist who's thinking about going pro? Maybe they're dreaming of doing big movies. Maybe they're doing small mom and pop stuff, car dealerships, yoga studios. Anything that you would say to that person who's watching? Anything you feel like we need to add?
I guess I'll put it this way. I think. You don't have to be working with big brand names, because what I found is that, the bigger the production, the more red tape there is, and in a lot of cases, even a lot less creativity. So I used to think that, like, oh, here I am, I'm just doing a bowling alley or whatever, when I could be working with Michael Bay or doing this next big movie or whatever. I'll just say that the grass isn't always greener on the other side, because oftentimes, especially like a commercial, because it's like this 30-second piece, every frame is highly criticized, and there isn't always room for creativity from the drone pilot. So it's literally just executing on what the director or DP sees as their vision, which isn't always the most gratifying. Obviously, it's great if you can nail what they want. Right? That always feels great. But what I've personally found is, like, on like feature films or like movies, where they lean on me a lot more about, like, hey, what's a cool shot that we could do with this? Like that to me is like amazing. but you only really get that, in my opinion, at least my experience, with like these feature films, especially if the director DP trusts you enough to ask you to do that, right? Or on these, what I'll just call smaller, but not to take away from smaller productions, where it is like a bowling alley or just whatever, like a mom and pop style business. You absolutely have way more creative freedom in that regard, and I think that's, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like sometimes some people are doing that, but aspiring to do this other stuff. Like, hey, like if you want to go for it, but it's not like you've made it when you go here, because oftentimes you'll find that, I go on to these bigger productions and I'm doing what I'm asked, but it is like the simplest, not very creative thing. The other thing that I'll say to you, this is kind of more of a rant. Usually you can fill this in where you want. So if anybody that follows me, you'll probably notice I haven't put a lot of content up, if anything at all lately. And a lot of that is because when you're on these higher productions with these bigger clients, you're on some crazy NDAs. Like oftentimes I can't even do it behind the scenes. I can't even tell you that I'm working on certain things. And it sucks, especially as a content creator, where we come from the world of freestyle. Like, I just want to show you everything I'm doing. And this is fun. This is great. Like, this is cool. And you can't do that. Like you actually don't own the rights to the footage that you shoot. So even if it comes out and you have something that they didn't take or use, which is very, very common, like they'll ask me to do the craziest thing. And I'm like, at first, I'm like, no, I don't want to do that because I don't want to wreck my drone. And then I pull it off. And then at the end of the day, when I find the comment, they didn't even use it, or they've whittled down this most epic, flight path, and it's just whittled down to these tiny frames. You don't own it. And at least as a content creator, that hurts me, because I'm like, there's a part of me that's like, I want to show off what I'm doing. Like, I'm still here, but you can't. And I feel like when you're at the low, I don't want to call it lower, that's probably not the word, but just when you're on these smaller productions where NDAs aren't as critical or as intense, you have that freedom. So, there's pros and cons to both sides. But my biggest gripe is that I can't always talk about or show what I'm working on, no matter how cool it is. You know what I mean? But yeah, I'll leave it at that.